The Silver Ridge Equestrian Showcase buzzed with excitement under a bright, clear sky. The event was a grand spectacle, one of the biggest equestrian gatherings of the year, and the anticipation in the air was palpable. Hundreds of spectators, mostly ranchers, trainers, and equestrian enthusiasts, filled the grandstands, their eyes fixed on the massive arena. In the center of it all, a wild stallion stood, chained and restrained, ready to be broken. Thunder, the stallion in question, was a sight to behold. His black coat gleamed under the sun, and his muscles rippled with raw power. His eyes burned with a fiery spirit, challenging anyone to tame him. He had come from the wild Nevada plains, a creature untouched by human hands, and that untamed nature was evident in the way he stood, defiant and restless. The trainers, one after another, had attempted to break Thunder, each failure only adding to the stallion's legendary status. Ropes, whips, tranquilizers, nothing had worked. Thunder resisted every attempt, bucking and kicking, his wild spirit refusing to be subdued. The crowd murmured in awe, some laughing nervously, others watching with disbelief as each trainer failed to gain control. "This one's got a heart of steel," the announcer chuckled into the microphone, his voice carrying across the arena. "They say he doesn't bow to anyone. Let's see if that's true." The crowd responded with a mixture of laughs and gasps, knowing that this wild stallion was more than just a spectacle. He was a challenge, and for most, he was an impossibility. But then, something unexpected happened. The sound of wheels rolling over gravel interrupted the tension in the air. Julian Price, a 17-year-old boy, appeared at the entrance of the arena, rolling slowly into view in his wheelchair. His presence was met with confused murmurs from the crowd. Julian was a sight that few had expected to see here. His once strong athletic body now bound to a chair, paralyzed from the waist down after a tragic ATV accident 2 years ago. He had once been a champion equestrian, known for his fearless riding and unmatched skills in the arena. But that life had been taken from him in an instant, leaving him in a state of emotional and physical limbo. His mother, Sarah Price, walked beside him, her face a mixture of hope and concern. The crowd didn't know what to make of this. A boy in a wheelchair coming to watch a wild stallion? It seemed almost absurd, and whispers of doubt spread quickly. "Is he really going to try something?" one person muttered. "He's in a wheelchair. What's he going to do with that horse?" Sarah, who had encouraged Julian to attend the event, looked at him with quiet hope. She had brought him here not for the spectacle, but in hopes that this event might stir something within him. A spark that might remind him of the life he once had. Julian had been distant and withdrawn ever since the accident, and she had hoped that seeing the horses again would bring back some part of the fearless boy she once knew. Julian didn't notice the murmurs or the skeptical looks. His eyes were fixed on Thunder, the wild stallion. There was no fear in his gaze, no hesitation, just a quiet resolve. As he wheeled closer to the ring, Julian stopped just outside, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, knuckles white from the force. The crowd grew still, watching him with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Even the announcer seemed unsure of what to say. "Well, folks, looks like we have a surprise here," he said, trying to mask his confusion. "It looks like the kid wants a shot at Thunder." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. "This should be good," someone muttered. But Julian didn't react to their laughter or whispers. He was focused on the stallion. He didn't try to make himself seem strong. There was no bravado in his posture, no challenge in his stance. He just stared at Thunder, quietly, as if willing the horse to see him, to understand him. "I know what it's like to lose control," Julian said softly. his voice carrying just far enough for Thunder to hear. The words seemed strange, almost too simple to be of any importance. He wasn't commanding the horse, wasn't demanding it bow. He wasn't even trying to control the wild creature. In that moment, it wasn't about domination. It was about something far deeper, something that no one could quite understand yet. Thunder, sensing the change in the air, turned his head sharply toward Julian. The stallion snorted loudly, pawing at the ground, his eyes burning with uncertainty and rage. The crowd held its breath, wondering what would happen next. Julian didn't flinch. His face remained calm, his eyes steady on Thunder. There was no fear in him, only a quiet strength. Slowly, without a single movement on Julian's part, Thunder circled around him, moving with jerky, unpredictable steps. The massive horse stomped the ground, but Julian didn't retreat. He didn't raise his hands in command or attempt to assert control. He simply waited. The crowd, now utterly captivated, watched in stunned silence. The raw energy in the arena was palpable, thick with tension. The impossible was unfolding before their eyes. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, Thunder stopped. He lowered his head slowly, inch by inch, until the wild stallion was kneeling before Julian, the defiance in his eyes replaced with something softer, something almost resigned. The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd, who had been on the edge of their seats moments before, now sat still, their jaws dropped in disbelief. They had expected a spectacle of failure, a battle between boy and beast, but what they saw instead was a quiet, unspoken understanding. Thunder, the untamable wild stallion, had bowed to Julian. A gasp broke the silence, and then slowly, the crowd erupted into applause. But it wasn't the usual, loud, exuberant cheer of a traditional performance. It was a quiet, respectful clap, a gesture of awe for the unexpected bond that had formed between the boy in the wheelchair and the wild stallion. Julian, however, didn't hear the applause. He didn't hear the excited murmurs or the stunned gasps. His attention was solely on Thunder, the wild horse that had just, against all odds, knelt before him. For a moment, Julian allowed himself to feel it, the connection. It wasn't about the applause, the attention, or the victory. It was about something deeper, something that had been missing from his life for so long. For the first time in 2 years, Julian felt alive again. The arena was filled with stunned silence, and then, as the applause continued to echo around him, Julian wheeled himself slowly away from the arena, his heart full. This was just the beginning. He didn't know where this journey would take him, or what would come next. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had found something worth fighting for. The days following Julian's unexpected moment with Thunder were a blur of media attention, public curiosity, and internal conflict. Word of the wild stallion bowing to a boy in a wheelchair spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of Silver Ridge and beyond. News outlets were abuzz with the footage, social media was flooded with clips, and reporters sought Julian's story from every angle. But for Julian, the aftermath was anything but exhilarating. He had never craved the spotlight, and now that it was thrust upon him, he found himself tangled in a whirlwind of doubts and pressure. Every time he left his room or wheeled himself out into the yard, there were cameras, reporters, and people asking him the same questions, eager for some profound answer that he didn't have. "Is it true that Thunder bowed to you because of your courage?" one reporter had asked him just the day after the event. "How did you do it? What was your secret?" The questions were constant, but the answers felt hollow to Julian. How could he explain something so personal, so deeply felt, when he wasn't sure what had happened himself? It wasn't courage that had made Thunder kneel. It wasn't strength or sheer will. It had simply been a moment of trust, a connection he hadn't expected, but desperately needed. The words didn't come easily. As the media frenzy continued, Sarah, his mother, could see the toll it was taking on him. Julian had always been the confident, competitive boy who dominated the equestrian world. But now, sitting in his wheelchair, he seemed lost, uncertain, overwhelmed by everything he hadn't asked for. Sarah had hoped that bringing Julian to the Silver Ridge showcase would rekindle some spark in him, but she hadn't anticipated the emotional fallout that would follow. "Julian, you're not doing this for anyone else," Sarah said one evening, as they sat in the quiet of their living room. The soft light of the lamps cast long shadows on the walls. "You're not here to impress the world. You did something special with Thunder. That's what matters." Julian looked at his mother, her face tired but kind. She had always been the supportive one, the one who saw the best in him, even when he couldn't see it himself. But even her words felt distant now. "I didn't ask for this," Julian muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like I'm trapped in a story that's not even mine anymore. People think I've done something amazing, but it's not. It's not what it seems. I don't even know how I did it." "You didn't do it alone," Sarah replied gently. "Thunder didn't just kneel because of you. He kneeled because he trusted you. That's not something that can be faked, Julian. That's real." But trust, real trust, was something Julian struggled with now. After the accident, after the loss of his ability to walk, his world had shattered. Trust was no longer easy to give or to receive. He couldn't even trust his own body. How could he expect a horse, a wild, untamable stallion, to trust him, to see him as something other than broken? The following days were a blur of quiet moments and painful realizations. Julian spent more time with Thunder, but now there was a distance between them that hadn't been there before. Thunder, once fierce and untouchable, was now calm and receptive to Julian's presence, but there was still a certain hesitation, a wariness in the stallion's eyes. Julian wondered if Thunder, like him, was unsure about the bond they had formed. Hank, the seasoned trainer who had worked with Thunder for months before Julian's arrival, observed the shift with quiet concern. Julian had shown an incredible ability to connect with Thunder, but now that the media had left, now that the pressure was mounting, Hank feared that Julian was losing touch with the very thing that had made their bond special. One afternoon, as Julian sat in his wheelchair by the corral, Hank approached. His face was lined with experience, his graying hair and weathered hands betraying years of hard work with horses. He had been one of the few people to witness the moment when Thunder had knelt before Julian, and he knew something rare had happened. "You're doubting yourself, kid," Hank said, his voice rough but understanding. "I can see it. It's not about the crowd or the cameras. You've got something with Thunder that no one else does. Don't let the noise drown that out. I'm not sure I even deserve it," Julian said quietly, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair. "Everything I've ever known it's gone. My life, the horses, the competitions, it's all just gone. I don't know how to be that person anymore." "You don't have to be that person," Hank replied, leaning against the corral fence. "You're not the same kid you were before the accident, but that doesn't mean you've lost everything. What you've got now is something deeper. You're working with Thunder in a way no one else can. That's something special." Julian looked at the ground, his mind racing. He wanted to believe Hank. He wanted to trust that the connection he had with Thunder wasn't a fluke, that it was real. But the doubts still gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the loss he had suffered. Thunder stood in the corner of the corral, his wild eyes softening as he turned to Julian. The horse took a few hesitant steps forward, his hooves clopping against the dirt. Julian's heart fluttered. Thunder was coming closer, just as he had before. Slowly, Julian wheeled himself forward, stopping just a few feet from the stallion. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken energy between them. There was no need for commands, no need for force. This was their time. Time to rebuild the trust that had begun in the arena and had since wavered under the weight of Julian's doubts. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then, as if recognizing the familiar bond between them, Thunder moved closer. His breath was warm on Julian's skin, his eyes filled with curiosity. Slowly, the stallion lowered his head, as if offering a silent apology for the distance he had kept. Julian reached out a trembling hand, gently brushing his fingers against Thunder's neck. The horse didn't flinch. He stood still, accepting Julian's touch. "It's okay," Julian whispered. "I trust you too." And in that moment something shifted. Julian could feel the weight of his fears lifting, slowly but surely. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving forward. He wasn't the same person he had been before, but maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a bad thing. As the sun began to set over Silver Ridge, Julian stayed by the corral, his fingers gently tracing the contours of Thunder's mane. The world around them was quiet, and for a brief moment Julian allowed himself to simply exist in the stillness, to feel the trust that had been rebuilt between him and the wild stallion. The days that followed Julian's quiet reconnection with Thunder were filled with both growth and pressure. Thunder had been less resistant since that afternoon, more willing to approach Julian and let him be near. The bond between them had deepened, but it still wasn't enough. Julian knew that Thunder had to fully trust him, not just for a moment, but consistently, if they were going to move forward. However, as their bond strengthened, so did the external pressure. The media had moved on to other stories, but the echo of Julian's success at Silver Ridge still hung in the air. The whispers of doubt, however, only grew louder. People who had once been in awe now questioned whether Julian's connection with Thunder had been a fluke, a moment of luck, a distraction for the crowds. The trainers who had worked with Thunder before Julian's arrival were especially vocal. They had watched from the sidelines as the young boy in the wheelchair had tamed the wild stallion in a matter of minutes. To them, it felt like a slap in the face, a humiliation. They had spent months working with Thunder, using ropes and force, and yet here was Julian, who had never worked with a horse like this before, seemingly achieving what they couldn't. "You can't just walk into a ring and expect a miracle," one trainer had muttered, the words carrying a sharp edge of skepticism. "The horse wasn't tamed by some boy in a chair. He's just playing along for the crowd." Julian didn't let the harsh words affect him, or at least that's what he told himself. But the pressure of those comments, the weight of his own doubts, the eyes that followed his every move, it was all starting to get to him. He didn't feel like he was playing some game. He felt like he was trying to prove something to himself, something far deeper than the applause of the crowd. It was Hank who first noticed the shift. They were working with Thunder in the corral one evening, the sun dipping low behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the dusty ground. Thunder was grazing, his once wild energy now calmed by the presence of the boy who had gently coaxed him into trust. Julian, however, was still uneasy. "You're holding back," Hank said, his voice steady, though it carried a note of concern. "I can see it in your eyes. What happened to the kid who walked into that arena a few weeks ago and faced Thunder down without flinching?" Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had been silent for a while, his focus split between Thunder and the distant horizon. The memories of the competition, the moment when Thunder had knelt before him, still echoed in his mind. It felt like a lifetime ago. But now, the weight of the expectations, the constant buzz of judgment, had started to chip away at his confidence. "I don't know," Julian finally admitted. I thought I could just keep going, that things would get easier. But now, every time I wheel myself up to Thunder, I wonder if it was all just a fluke. If I can really do this." Hank looked at him, his expression softening with understanding. "You're scared," he said simply. "Scared of failing, scared of proving everyone right. But you're looking at it all wrong. This isn't about proving something to anyone. It's about proving it to yourself." Julian looked down, his fingers nervously gripping the armrests of his wheelchair. He wanted to believe Hank, wanted to push past the doubt and fear, but it wasn't so simple. How could he trust in a bond that felt so fragile? How could he know for sure that what had happened in the arena wasn't just a momentary connection? A lucky break that he didn't deserve? Thunder snorted, shaking his mane, breaking Julian's thoughts. The wild stallion was grazing nearby, but there was something different in his posture. An alertness, an openness. Thunder's eyes met Julian's, and for a moment everything else seemed to fade. The doubt, the pressure, the whispers, they all seemed to vanish, leaving only the quiet connection between the two of them. "I don't think you're ready to face Thunder just yet," Hank said, his voice quiet but firm. "But that doesn't mean you should stop trying. You're not broken, Julian. You're just not there yet. But every step you take toward him, toward trusting yourself again, that's the real work. That's the real healing." Julian turned to Hank, his eyes meeting his mentor's gaze. "What do you mean?" Hank nodded toward Thunder, who was now standing still, his head low, his body relaxed. "I mean that Thunder's not the only one who needs to heal. You do too. Trust is a two-way street, and right now, you're not trusting yourself the way you're trusting him." Julian took in Hank's words. He had never considered it that way. He had been so focused on Thunder, on building the connection with the horse, that he hadn't stopped to think about what he needed. To trust himself, to believe in his own strength again. But the memories of his accident, of losing everything, made it so hard to imagine that kind of trust again. "I don't know if I can," Julian whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. "You don't have to do it all at once," Hank replied, his voice steady. "It's small steps, Julian. It's about showing up every day, even when you're afraid, just like Thunder." The next day, Julian found himself by the corral again, alone with Thunder. The morning sun was shining brightly, casting warm light over the open field. Thunder was standing near the fence, his tail swishing lazily, his body at ease. Julian wheeled himself forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he knew one thing: he needed to try again. Thunder didn't flinch when Julian approached. In fact, the stallion seemed to acknowledge him, his ears flicking forward. Julian paused, watching the horse's movements, feeling the weight of the moment. There was no crowd here, no media, no pressure, just him and Thunder. The horse's powerful muscles rippled as he took a few steps closer. Julian wheeled forward cautiously, his eyes never leaving Thunder's. He didn't speak, didn't give any commands. He just stayed steady, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair. And then, something happened. Thunder stopped a few feet away from him, his large frame still and calm. For a brief moment they simply looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Julian reached out slowly, his hand shaking as it hovered near Thunder's neck. The stallion didn't pull away. Instead, he took a step closer, almost as if inviting Julian to touch him. Julian's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was what he had been waiting for. The connection wasn't just with Thunder. It was with himself. He had to trust himself. Trust that he could face the fear, face the doubt, and still move forward. With a deep breath, Julian extended his hand, gently resting it on Thunder's neck. The stallion didn't flinch. He stood still, the warmth of his coat radiating under Julian's touch. It was a quiet moment, but it was enough. Julian smiled to himself, a sense of peace settling in his chest. He wasn't there yet, not fully, but this was a start. He had trusted himself to take that step, and Thunder had responded. It wasn't a fluke, it wasn't a lucky moment. It was a bond, one that had been built on trust, patience, and understanding. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Julian felt like he was on the right path. Julian stood on the edge of the corral, watching as Thunder paced back and forth, his hooves stirring up dust. It had been weeks since that day in the arena when Thunder had knelt before him, but Julian still couldn't shake the feeling that the true challenge was only just beginning. It wasn't enough for them to connect once. They had to do it every day, in every situation, under all kinds of pressure. That was what Julian told himself when he woke up each morning, hoping today would be the day the bond would become unbreakable. But now, that pressure was no longer coming from the crowds or the media. It wasn't even about proving anything to anyone else. Julian had long since stopped caring about the whispers behind his back or the doubts that filled the spaces where his confidence used to be. The pressure he felt now was the weight of responsibility. Responsibility for Thunder, for himself, and for those who had begun to believe in the connection between them. And there was someone else who had started believing too. "Are you ready?" Hank's voice brought Julian back to the present. He was standing a few steps behind, watching Julian as he gazed at Thunder, still pacing in his pen. Julian didn't immediately respond. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in 100 different thoughts, but mostly the thought of what came next. He had worked with Thunder for weeks now, and while the progress had been slow, it was there. The wild stallion had begun responding to Julian's commands with more patience, more trust. Still, Julian knew that there was something more Thunder needed from him, something beyond what Julian had been able to give so far. "I think so," Julian said, his voice soft but steady. His hands rested on the armrests of his wheelchair, gripping them tightly as if the weight of what he was about to do rested in his palms. Hank gave him a nod. "Remember, it's not about making Thunder do something. It's about letting him decide to trust you. If you try to force it, you'll lose him." Julian nodded. Hank's words echoed in his mind. He wasn't trying to control Thunder, not anymore. The days of forcing the stallion to obey him were long gone. What had worked, what had brought them this far, was patience, consistency, and trust. Thunder stopped pacing and turned toward them, his large dark eyes locking with Julian's. There was no hesitation in his gaze. It was as if the horse had come to understand something Julian himself hadn't fully grasped. Thunder wasn't just a wild stallion anymore. He was something more, a partner, a friend, someone who had been broken and who was learning, alongside Julian, how to trust again. "Are you going to let him come to you?" Hank asked, raising an eyebrow. Julian didn't answer right away. He just wheeled forward slowly, keeping his eyes locked on Thunder. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just another training session. This wasn't just another attempt to show the world what they could do. This was real. This was about healing. The wind rustled through the trees, and Thunder's ears flicked back and forth, his hooves shifting slightly in the soft earth. But he didn't move toward Julian. Instead, he stayed where he was, waiting, watching. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, and Julian felt a pang of doubt. Was he really ready for this? What if Thunder didn't respond? What if he never fully trusted him? But then, without warning, Thunder took a step forward, then another, and another. Each movement was slow, deliberate, and Julian could feel the shift in the air, the tension that had always been there between them beginning to melt away. The stallion's wildness was still present, but it was no longer a barrier. It was a challenge, a test, and it was one that Julian was ready to face. When Thunder finally reached him, he stopped a few feet away, his body tense but his eyes calm. Julian didn't move, didn't speak. He just sat there, waiting. Thunder's head dipped down slightly and his nose brushed against Julian's leg, almost as if to say, "I'm here." Julian's breath caught in his throat. The connection was deeper than anything he had expected. It wasn't just about him reaching Thunder. It was about Thunder reaching him, too. "You've got him," Hank said softly, his voice full of pride. "You're not just handling him. You're communicating with him. And he's listening." Julian didn't respond. He couldn't. He was overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just happened. For the first time in months, Julian didn't feel broken. He didn't feel like the boy in the wheelchair who had once been a champion rider. He didn't feel the weight of his accident or the doubts that had filled his mind for so long. In that moment, all he felt was peace. "I think we've got more work to do," Julian said, finally breaking the silence. He turned to Hank, offering a small, genuine smile. "But it feels like we're getting there." Hank nodded. "You're getting there, but so is Thunder." The next few days passed in a blur for Julian. He spent more and more time with Thunder, each moment bringing them closer. The connection was growing, but it wasn't just about the physical work anymore. Julian had stopped focusing on the grand gestures, the big moments. What mattered now were the quiet ones. The way Thunder would lean into him when he reached out. The way he would walk beside him without hesitation. The way they had begun to move in sync, like a well-worn rhythm. But just as Julian was starting to feel like they had truly reached a breakthrough, an unexpected phone call arrived that would send everything into a new direction. Sarah had been the one to answer it. Julian had been sitting outside, watching Thunder graze in the corral, when he saw his mother step outside, her face pale. "Julian, we need to talk," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Julian wheeled himself over to her, worry creeping up his spine. "What's wrong?" "I just got off the phone with someone from a non-profit organization. They've been following your story, Julian. They want to offer you and Thunder a chance to work with children who have disabilities. They think your bond could help them. Help other kids who are facing challenges like you've faced." The words took a moment to register. Julian blinked, unsure of what to say. He had never thought about using his connection with Thunder to help anyone else, let alone children who had been through what he had. "Do you think we're ready?" Julian asked, the question heavy in his mind. Thunder had come a long way, but was he ready to work with kids? Was he ready to help others? Sarah took a deep breath. "I think it's more than just helping them, Julian. It's about you, too. It's about using what you've learned to give back, to show them that healing is possible. I think this could be the next step in your journey. You and Thunder together. You've both come so far." Julian sat in silence, contemplating his mother's words. He wasn't sure if he was ready for something like this. But as he looked out at Thunder, who had stopped grazing and was now standing still, watching him with those deep, soulful eyes, he felt a spark of something. It wasn't just about him anymore. Maybe it never had been. The next day, Julian and Thunder arrived at the nonprofit's therapy center. The children there were waiting, their faces lighting up as they saw the boy in the wheelchair and the wild stallion by his side. Julian had no idea what to expect, but as he wheeled Thunder into the barn, he felt a deep sense of purpose begin to settle in his chest. Thunder stood still, his massive frame towering over the children. But Julian wasn't worried. He had already learned that the horse wouldn't be tamed by force. It would be through trust. It would be through connection. As one of the children, a young girl named Sophie, approached, her eyes wide with wonder, Julian felt a quiet strength inside him. This wasn't just about healing his own wounds anymore. This was about helping others heal too. Julian smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. This was what he had been waiting for. This was the next step. The sun hung low in the sky as Julian wheeled his chair across the dirt path, Thunder walking calmly beside him. The field ahead stretched out in front of them, bathed in the warm golden light of the evening. The sounds of the crowd were distant, like a muffled hum behind a curtain. For the first time in a long time, Julian felt at peace. No expectations, no pressure, just the quiet company of the wild stallion who had become his partner in healing. This was it. The culmination of everything they had been through. The painful beginning, the long journey of trust, the moments of doubt and the triumphs. Tonight, they were not just performing for an audience, they were demonstrating something deeper. It wasn't about proving their bond to the world, it was about acknowledging it, together. This was their full circle moment. As they entered the arena, the soft buzz of the crowd became louder. The spotlight, not just from the lights but from the attention of the hundreds in the stands, was on them. Julian gripped the armrests of his chair, his hand steady as he guided himself toward the center of the ring. Thunder followed beside him, his hooves striking the ground with a steady rhythm, the wildness that once defined him now replaced by an unmistakable calm. "I'm not doing this for anyone but us," Julian whispered to Thunder, more to himself than the horse. There was a moment of silence, a pause where time seemed to stretch, and then he added, "We've already won." The announcer's voice echoed through the stadium, his words carrying the weight of anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Julian Price and Thunder, the wild stallion who captured the world's attention. Tonight, they're here to show you what true trust looks like." Julian didn't look at the crowd. He didn't need to. His eyes were focused on Thunder, the steady rhythm of their movements creating a quiet, powerful bond between them. As they reached the center of the arena, Julian paused, allowing the moment to settle. He wasn't nervous anymore. This wasn't a competition for victory. This was their shared journey, an affirmation of everything they had worked for. He gently tugged on the wheels of his chair, moving them in a small circle, and Thunder matched his movements, moving with ease and grace. The crowd remained still, captivated by the silent communication between the boy and the horse. It was as if everyone in the arena understood what Julian had long realized. This was no spectacle. This was real. Thunder wasn't a trained circus animal, nor was Julian a performer seeking applause. They were simply two souls who had found each other, two beings learning to trust, to heal. For a moment, Julian could feel the weight of the world, of his past, his struggles, the harsh criticism that had followed him and Thunder since their first public appearance. He thought about the doubters, the whispers, the naysayers. There had been times when he had nearly given up, when the pressure to meet everyone else's expectations had almost broken him. But here, now, with Thunder at his side, Julian realized that none of that mattered. The real victory was the quiet, steady trust they had built over time. The next part of the performance was something Julian had practiced in his mind, but had never done in front of an audience. It was a test, not of Thunder's obedience, but of their connection, an unspoken promise between them. He wheeled forward slowly, taking a deep breath as he spoke the words that had become a mantra for him and the stallion. "Come on, Thunder," Julian murmured, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. Thunder's ears flicked forward, and for a brief moment Julian thought the horse might hesitate, just as he had so many times before. But instead, Thunder moved. It was slow at first, uncertain, but then with growing confidence, the stallion began to walk alongside Julian, step by step. The crowd gasped as they watched the powerful animal, once wild and untamable, moving in perfect sync with the boy in the wheelchair. Julian smiled softly to himself, not because of the applause that began to ripple through the crowd, but because of what that moment meant for him. It wasn't about winning the crowd's approval. It was about reclaiming a piece of himself he had thought lost forever. He wasn't just a boy in a wheelchair anymore. He wasn't just the kid who had once ridden with fearless abandon. He was Julian Price, the boy who had learned to trust again, who had rebuilt his life not by forcing his way back into the world, but by understanding that healing came in small steps, in quiet moments of connection. As Thunder walked beside him, Julian's hand stayed firmly on the wheels of his chair. He didn't need to guide the horse anymore. He didn't need to prove anything. Thunder was walking with him because they understood each other now. No words were needed. Julian gently placed his hand on Thunder's neck, a gesture of both gratitude and reassurance. The horse paused, and for a brief moment the two of them stood still, the crowd's applause fading into the background. This wasn't just a performance. This was a culmination of everything they had been through together. The struggles, the doubts, the triumphs. They had both been broken in different ways, but now they were whole again. Not because of what they had achieved for others, but because they had healed each other. Thunder shifted slightly, his hooves grazing the dirt, and Julian turned his chair slowly, guiding the stallion as they moved together. There was a subtle power in their movements now, a quiet confidence that came from trust, not domination, not control. The audience could see it too. It wasn't just the boy and the horse anymore. It was the boy and the stallion who had learned to be gentle with each other, who had learned to find peace in the midst of their pasts. As Julian wheeled to the edge of the arena, he caught a glimpse of his mother in the stands, her eyes glistening with pride. She had been there from the beginning. Her unwavering support, her belief in him, even when he had lost belief in himself. This journey wasn't just about him healing. It was about the way his mother had always been there, quietly cheering him on, even when the road was dark. "Thank you," Julian whispered to Thunder, more to himself than the horse, "for helping me find my way back." The stallion nickered softly, his head dipping down once more. It wasn't a bow of submission. It was a simple gesture of understanding. Julian had trusted him, and Thunder had returned that trust, not with dominance but with acceptance. The crowd stood, their applause growing louder, but Julian didn't hear it. He didn't need to. He had already found the victory he had been searching for, not in the arena, but in the quiet moments between him and Thunder. As they exited the arena together, the final rays of the sun cast long shadows across the dirt. The journey had taken them to places they had never expected. For Julian, the road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years he knew he wasn't walking it alone. He wasn't just a boy in a wheelchair anymore. He was someone who had learned to trust, to heal, and most importantly, to hope. And Thunder, the wild stallion who had once been untamable, had become his companion in that journey. A symbol of healing, not just for Julian, but for everyone who had been touched by their story.